Guys, welcome back to another episode where we're talking about the POPIA Act. This is something that maybe is not the most exciting and sexy topic that you've ever heard us talk about, but in truth, this is one of the things that as an online seller, you can't avoid and you have to know about it to avoid getting yourself in hot water, because maybe you ignore it now and you get away with it, but it might just catch up with you. So there are some specific things that you need to know and to apply. And to help us to all understand this, because I am by no means an expert on this, what I've done is I've invited an expert on this and other topics to talk to us about this topic. And that is Kyle Torrington, who's joining me here, and we're going to jump into this topic. But first up, Kyle, thanks for joining, and why don't you get things going by just giving a brief introduction to yourself and to what it is that you do.
Cool, thanks, Warwick. Hello to your listeners as well, or your viewers, I would say. So I head up a company named HelloContract, and HelloContract is essentially a platform for small businesses to create on an automated basis contracts and policies such as privacy policies, terms and conditions, or other business legal documents in a manner that's custom fitted to them. So they're not templates. It's a case of answering a bunch of questions, prompting you to think about aspects you might have not otherwise thought of, but which are necessary to include in these contracts. And from there, a contract or a policy is automatically generated and emailed to you. This was actually learned through my main business, which is Legal Legends, which provides small businesses and startups with legal services in all aspects of their business, from IP to labor to corporate commercial, whatever the case may be.
That's really cool. And, I think that sets a scene for telling everybody that you know what you're talking about when it comes to legal stuff and all kinds of lawyering that we all try and avoid. But it might catch up with us, especially if we don't do things right in the beginning. And one of the things that we need to understand right now and make sure that we do get right is everything around the POPIA Act or the POPIA Act, or you can clarify exactly what it is. In fact, why don't you just give us like a broad overview of the POPIA Act and kind of where we're going with this?
Sure, yeah. Maybe just to add to your previous point there, I'm also an admitted attorney, so it does help with my knowledge somewhat of legal aspects. So with regard to POPIA, Protection of Personal Information Act, they're all the same thing. I prefer POPIA just because the pronunciation of POPIA is a little bit weird. So I go with that. It's essentially the primary piece of legislation in South Africa which regulates the collection, processing, and sharing of personal information of data subjects. So maybe just to bring it to something relatable to your users, if I'm a e-commerce web store owner, this is primarily how I will treat the information, the personal information that I collect from my users and say purchases from my website, and what I do with that information. What is the purpose for me collecting it, and who do I share it with? So that's POPIA in a nutshell as it pertains specifically to e-commerce website owners. There are a host of other sections of the site, sections of the Act, but I don't think they are too necessary for the purposes of our discussion today.
Cool. Well, I'm glad we're narrowing it down, because the audience here today, we're talking about e-commerce. So I'm sure there's many different aspects to it, but we need to be like, let's focus on what we should be knowing. But, first up, I think it's important for us to just recognize that the POPIA Act is a good thing. I want my personal information protected. I don't want random people SMSing me. It irritates the daylights out of me. I don't want random people spamming my email, and I don't want my information to be shared with whoever pays for it. So for me, I think POPIA is great from a consumer side of things, if I put my consumer hat on, but also from a seller's point of view, one of the things it's going to do that I like is that these kind of policies help to build more trust. And when there's more trust and people can go and shop online without worrying about their details being sold or stolen or given away freely, then that in itself is going to encourage more people to shop online. So I think I like to just put it out there that this is actually a positive thing. And while we do need to make some changes on our site and just get ready for it, ultimately, when this change comes into effect and once it's settled down, then it will be positive for the e-commerce market overall. So as we look at e-commerce specifically, you've touched on it a little bit, but in terms of an online seller, can you just dive into the aspects like that are the most relevant for us?
Sure. So out of all 100-odd sections, I would say the most relevant aspect for an e-commerce website owner and its users is Section 18. This is essentially all the information that needs to be notified to users of your site in which will most likely be a privacy policy. So what is very, very important for all the e-commerce owners in their privacy policy and in terms of the Section 18 to state what personal information is collected. Normally with e-commerce website owners, you're collecting your first name, surname, email address, and a physical address at the very least. That is all regarded as personal information. Second to that, you will need to also record your business's name as well as your address, just so that people know if there are queries or if there are disputes that they can go to somebody. And it isn't just a simple website. There is an actual entity behind it that is accountable at the end of the day. Then you need to look at record the purpose for which you are collecting this personal information. Normally, with an e-commerce website owner, the purpose is to enable you to provide your services of being able to procure this product that you're selling and deliver it to the user. Alternatively, or in addition, it might be, for example, well, we have the right to also market to you for services that we do render or will render in future. And we might have to use it to courier items to you, for example. Those purposes need to be specifically stated in your privacy policy. Then you need to go into some other aspects, such as whether or not the personal information provided is voluntary or mandatory. In the case of an e-commerce website, it's mandatory. If I don't get your physical address, you're not getting your product, unfortunately. After that, in addition to that, you need to look at and record the categories of the persons or the entities that are recipients of this information. For example, if I've got an e-commerce site and I'm maybe running it on WordPress or Shopify, I've most likely got a payment gateway, whether it be PayFast or Paygate or something to that effect, which means that you as the website owner will most likely not be storing that financial information. Financial information, incidentally, is also personal information. So you need to state that your payment gateway provider, such as PayFast, will be a recipient of this personal information. In addition to that, if you use, for example, View Africa, and you outsource your couriering, that information will also be shared with those couriers. I see you want to get involved there. Warwick, do you want to ask something? Or?
Go for it. I'm appreciating how deep your knowledge is about e-commerce, that you know all the various parties involved. So yeah, I'm loving it.
No sweat. No, I also run my own e-commerce site and have developed the site myself over the years. So I do have a little bit of knowledge of that. Knowledge of that as well. Then you need to look at aspects such as recording. Well, you've got to tell the user, you've got a right to access this personal information, and you've got a right to rectify what might be wrong. For example, your name might be incorrect, your telephone number might be incorrect, and the user needs to know that they have a right to access this, as well as the process to access it and rectify it. Then you need to finally record, if, for example, a user has a complaint, that they can go to the information regulator, which is the enforcement arm of POPIA, and complain to the information regulator if they, for whatever reason, feel that you are abusing their personal information or the manner in which you process it. So that, although there are a number of other aspects, that is predominantly the most important aspects that e-commerce website owners need to take cognizance of when running an e-commerce website.
Sure, that's it's more than I knew, to be honest. So I'm glad that we're going through this, and you know, with this recording, we can just rewind and just kind of write down like, what did Kyle Torrington say we need to put in here. But I suppose also, like, a little side punt, this isn't a sales pitch for HelloContract, but you know, for anybody who's looking for a thorough South Africanized privacy policy, then HelloContract.co.za does actually provide these things to you. Really cool service.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and very much needed. So, you know, the POPIA Act, it's been whispered for a few years now. It's been enforced, but it's not yet enforced. Like, talk to me a little bit about the deadlines that have come up, because it's already in place, but when do we have to have this sorted out by?
Yeah, so it was promulgated in 2013. So it's been around for about the last 8 years, but it only properly came into force on the 1st of July of last year, 1 July 2020, but with a 1-year grace period in which to allow yourselves to comply with the Act. So I think you have until the end of June, so it gives us from today's date around about 5 more months to comply with POPIA. So it is decent to have that grace period, but the reality is we've actually had a grace period for the past 7 or so years, since 2013, with the knowledge that this is all going to come into place and be enforceable at some stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so end of June is when we need to have implemented all of these changes. And What would happen if 1st of July comes around? Or let's just say we never do this. Like we never update our privacy policy, we don't do things correctly. Like what could be the repercussions of actually just never complying with POPI?
Well, there are two avenues of repercussions. One being the enforcement regulator. For whatever reason, it's unlikely that they might come across your site and go, hold on, the site doesn't have a privacy policy. They're sharing all sorts of personal information. I'd like to investigate this particular website. Alternatively, you could have a website user who's been, sorry, do you want to jump in there?
No.
Oh, okay. You have a website user who goes, hold on, this particular website is abusing my personal information, sharing it without a privacy policy or against their privacy policy. I would like to complain. So he would then go to the information regulator and complain. So then it sort of comes together, whether it be initiated by the information regulator or initiated by the user. It now goes to the information regulator who, if they feel after a preliminary investigation is your website is not compliant, they can either refer it to a particular committee to investigate further, or if they're satisfied that it doesn't comply with POPI, they can issue an enforcement notice. And then this effectively requires you to change certain things on your site, change the way that you're processing personal information, or change your privacy policy, or put up a privacy policy. And if you fail to comply with that compliance notice, then you could be referred to the SAPS for investigation, and I mean, it is regarded as a criminal offense. And at the end, if you are found guilty of the offense, it's jail to a maximum of 10 years or a fine. So that's effectively the consequences if you don't comply. But the reality is, I mean, it'll take a long time to get there because you've got millions of websites and only one enforcement regulator. But that, in theory, is how it should be panning out.
Okay, so this is something that we need to take seriously. And, you know, it's just one of those admin tasks, like let's get it done and make sure that we are compliant, because we wouldn't recommend anything otherwise. But, you know, one thing that comes up for me, especially when I look at GDPR and look at like European websites, and every time I land on those sites, there's this cookie thing that pops up, and it, like, I can't even see most of the website, and now I have to accept it before I can see the website. Sometimes I can't even see the site until I accept it, and like, honestly, sometimes I've bounced from a website because I don't know, like, what does it mean to give my cookies? I don't really want your cookies. Like I'm being joking around you a little bit, but like, what does it mean in terms of collecting cookies, and do we have to now add this to our website as part of POPI?
Yeah. So POPI itself doesn't really have a cookie policy. This is something that's more European based. So that is why you'll find, in terms of GDPR, you'll find most European sites have this cookie pop-up. The reality is most people still in their privacy policies record what cookies they use and gain their consent to use such cookies. So what is important going forward from a POPI perspective is not necessarily you agreeing to the cookie policy of the website, but you actively agreeing on they call it a specific informed consent manner to the privacy policy of the website. And that will, going forward, normally be your pop-up. Alternatively, it often comes up in a registration form with a simple checkbox which links to the privacy policy, so that users are able to consider the privacy policy, and that's informing themselves and then actively agreeing to it by means of clicking the checkbox. So that's really where it will impact the use of websites. But a lot of websites, and this is something that's very familiar to a lot of your viewers, I would think, and this is what most websites have been doing for the last however long, but that is the correct way to do it.
And just to clarify, in terms of the South African POPI Act, will we need to add a pop-up that customers will have to accept before they can engage with our site?
Not necessarily a pop-up, but you will have, wherever it comes up, before people share their personal information, whether it be through a form, a registration form, or whether it's through a pop-up, yes, they would have to agree to the privacy policy. However, if people are just browsing and not yet sharing personal information, then the pop-up would not be necessary until such point in time as they share the personal information. If that makes sense.
This is good news. This is really good news for everybody listening, and us included, because I've always felt that a GDPR cookie pop-up is going to hit your conversion rate. You know, not all customers know what it means. Then as much as we would think that customers are familiar with it, a lot of customers are new to shopping online. And now they're like, well, I just want to see this website. I want to see what they sell. I don't want to commit to anything.
Yeah.
And now they have to commit. And I've always felt that that would negatively impact your conversion rate. So if we can avoid having that pop-up until such time that somebody subscribes to our newsletter or goes through the checkout, and then at that point ask them to just tick the box to agree to our privacy policy, which is linked up, then that's going to be really good news. But what about like your Facebook pixel? Because as soon as somebody lands on your site, you start tracking them. Your Facebook pixel is recording them. Google Analytics is recording their activity. So how does that get brought into the POPI Act?
So aggregated and anonymized data is not regulated by the Act at all. Provided I cannot identify you, then I'm able to do whatever I want with that information. And this is, so Google Analytics, for example, as you say, your Facebook pixel, your Google pixels, whether it be a remarketing pixel, your analytics pixel that's on your site, that is just anonymized data. However, and this is where there's a bit of a debate in terms of GDPR, not POPI. It seems like IP addresses will be regarded as being, or are regarded in terms of the GDPR as personally identifiable. This is not the case in terms of POPI. So there's argument to say, well, as soon as I land on a particular website, I'm able to read their IP address. If they're a European citizen, and I have to comply with GDPR, in theory, I would have to gain their consent to my privacy policy prior to them using the website. There's a bit of a debate there. But in terms of POPI, that's not the case. But back to your question, anonymized, aggregated data, you can do with whatever you want because you can't identify any users from it.
Jeez, I'm glad we've got you on here, Kyle. This is really good news for everybody listening, because it's been like in the back of my mind, and I've been warning customers like, get ready with your cookie pop-ups, but it's going to hurt your conversion rate. And it reminds me of when the one-time PIN came into play. I think this was 2013 or 2014, and all of us online sellers, there was less of us back then, but we were so against it because we knew that the day that the one-time PIN started being sent to customers, previously it wasn't sent and customers could just pay easily. And now they had to get this SMS to their phone, and not everybody was set up. They didn't understand it. And we knew what was going to happen. And what happened is the time that came into effect, our sales went down. It did, like I said earlier, it added another level of trust. And so over time, just over a few short months, our sales then came back up and actually went higher, which was cool. But I feared that this would be a similar shift, is that we add this cookie banner, and there will be a minuscule decline in conversion rate until customers become okay with it. But if we don't have to have it, and if we can just listen to your advice and make sure that our website is compliant and that we have those tick boxes in all the right places, then for me, that is such a big benefit. And I'm really glad that we are having this conversation and sharing your wisdom with everybody who's listening in.
No sweat, yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, putting that checkbox in during the checkout process, but at a point in time, as I said, just provided it's prior to you actually collecting the personal information, then that's absolutely fine.
All right, so we're going to have to do some investigating to see how we can add that to the Shopify checkout on the first page, which might be tricky, but we'll figure it out. Maybe just add a pop-up, not a pop-up in your checkout. That would hurt your conversion rate. We'll figure it out.
With Shopify and the checkout process, are you using a plugin to create that checkout form, or is that something that's hard-coded by Shopify, or are you able to change the fields?
It's hard-coded to Shopify, and there is a box there to accept or decline marketing material. So perhaps we can just edit that. In fact, there'll be a follow-up to this for anybody who wants to know that, just like I do. Yeah.
So, for example, if you use Contact Form 7 or Ninja Forms as a plugin through WordPress, you're able to quite easily change that sign-up form. And just below it, as a required field, you would just add your checkbox with a hyperlink to the privacy policy, and that prior to you clicking the button, register or accept, that would be sufficient.
And we make it mandatory. Yeah, that sounds like a good solution. That's really cool. So, in terms of like the checkout and these tick boxes and stuff, I just had another question that kind of popped into my mind. And one thing that, like, there's always been a little bit of debate about when somebody buys from you. So a customer comes to your site and they buy from you, whether they give you permission to market to them or not. Like I think in POPI, I think it's section 69 is where they say that a customer of yours, by nature of them purchasing from you, they give you permission to market to them. Do you know if that changes with the rollout of the official POPI Act?
So that is direct marketing. So direct marketing is an unsolicited approach to a user and say, knock, knock, you've purchased from me, I've got this particular product, but you've only got one opportunity to do so, to get their informed consent. And if they turn it down, you can't do so again. So that is only in respect of past customers of your company. If you're doing cold calling, for example, and they're not a past customer, then you've got one approach only, once again, just to get their informed consent, whether or not they can market that particular product to you, I believe.
Interesting. Geez, that opens up a whole different lines of questions for me. Like when these people phone me, geez, it irritates me. I don't even know how they got my number.
Yeah.
But they've got one chance to call me until I tell them to get lost.
Yeah, absolutely. But the problem is, the reality is, and practically, you say, please remove me from the list. They hang up the phone and that's that. And then you're lost in the ether of a Vodacom call center until next week when they decide to call you again because you weren't removed from the list. But there's theory and there's what happens in reality, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, hopefully the POPIA Act will help to reduce that. I know I try and be as polite as I can, but sometimes it's just frustrating. Yeah. But this conversation has been very illuminating, and I'm so glad that we've had this. And I'd love to get you back on at another time. But just in terms of this conversation around the POPIA Act, have you got any other thoughts that you wanted to mention before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think it's a case of, for website owners, they might be very intimidated by POPIA. But the reality is, at the end of the day, no entity is ever going to be 100% compliant with POPIA. It is really, really difficult. So provided that you are in the most material aspects compliant with it, it's not that much of a headache. There is the requirement that you need to, on an ongoing basis, ensure that your systems, etc., do have the correct security measures. Make sure, if you're an e-commerce owner, stick with the latest software. For example, Shopify will do all of that for you. Where a lot of the hosting, etc., is done with them, where the security measures are done through them, etc. That it really does make, or it takes the headache from yourself in terms of complying with POPIA and puts it onto them. But yeah, comply in the main aspect. Section 18 is your main section of the Act that you need to look at, and use easy tools. I mean, such as, and I'm trying not to plug HelloContract, but ours, for example, you answer a couple of questions and you'll have a properly POPIA compliant and or a GDP compliant privacy policy in 5 or so minutes without having to do much research into POPIA yourself.
Well, that takes a lot of concerns off the plate of a lot of people that are listening to this, who've now thought, well, how do I do this? How do I do it right? Because now we know that we need to be compliant. Yeah. And you can just pop across to HelloContract.co.za and just go through the process, and I'll guide you to making that. But this is not supposed to be a plug for HelloContract, but it is a really cool service at the same time. So check it out.
Just to add to that, I mean, that's just the first step. Obviously, you can't have a privacy policy and act in a manner which is completely against what you've recorded in your privacy policy. So step 1, get your privacy policy. Step 2, make sure you act in accordance with it.
Absolutely. And I suppose there's so many other things that we could talk about in terms of returns policy, terms and conditions, and all of these things that, at Legal Legends and at HelloContract you guys focus on. And maybe we're going to have to get you back on another time, because obviously anybody who's listened to this to the end, to right now as we're wrapping this up, you guys now know that Kyle is an expert and that he knows his stuff. And I'm sure that you'd agree with me that we need to get Kyle back at some stage to help talk about other stuff, because I'm having tons of questions coming up right now, as I'm sure you are too. But Kyle, let's wrap this one up. And if you are happy to, we'll get you back on at some stage. And yeah, we really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you so much for your time. Fantastic, Warwick. And to your listeners and viewers, all the best. And I'm sure we'll chat with you all soon again. Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Kyle. Chat to you later. Bye.